What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are here with the final issue of Storm, Earth's Mightiest Mutant. Marvel canceled this. They literally canceled it at basically the 11th hour, so Muriwa had to wrap up all these plot threads. But as we go through this, what you guys are gonna start to realize really fast is how amazing this story could have been if Marvel had allowed it to continue. But alas, I don't know what's going on over there, and I think I'm gonna make a commentary video talking about it at some point, but Marvel's screwing the pooch, and they dicked over Muriwa so badly in this comic. So, what this does is this picks up with a conversation between Storm and the cosmic entity Eternity. And what Eternity says is, Aurora Monroe, what good has imprisoning your enemies done for you? Has your life stopped being in danger? Have your enemies reduced in number? Has your planet stopped being under the threat of destruction? Has your mental health now improved? Have your virtues rubbed off on the denizens to whom you pledged your protection? And he says, say what you will about our time together, Aurora. When you were my host, you were at least powerful enough to no longer fear the consequences of your impractical virtues. Now, this is an important thing to keep in mind, that over the course of Muriwa's run, there came a point when Storm was bonded to a portion of Eternity's power, and in doing so, by becoming his host, became the Eternal Storm. Now, it didn't mean that she was all powerful in every sense of the word, but she was drastically more powerful than she had been, hence a lot of the discussions that were going on about this comic regarding it being a power scaling comic. On some level, that was true. But Storm has been separated from Eternity for quite some time because there was a massive betrayal committed by Eternity that led to the two of them separating, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But Storm, in being here, looks up, sees Eternity, and asks, how? Right? And Eternity just says, calm yourself, child. Let me show you the cascading results of your folly. You chose not to violently strip Sengo of his life. You chose mercy. You chose to imprison him in a pocket dimension. Now keep in mind, the conflict between Storm and Shango started in Storm Volume 5, Issue 7, and more or less ran all the way up to issue number 10, kind of on again, off again. But the long and short of it is that Shango's basically part of a pantheon of existing storm gods. And with Storm fancying herself to be a goddess because of the power that she has, they rivaled her, challenged her. And in that conflict, Storm banished Shango to a pocket dimension, which she had been doing for a variety of gods that were coming after her, or at the very least trying to destroy her. That's what's being referred to here. And so when Eternity talks about the consequences of this, he says, your mercy nevertheless left Shango's realm without a storm god to protect it. And that was when Hadad arrived alongside the other members of Death's army to basically destroy that realm. Now, those of you guys who have forgotten here, Hadad was originally presented to us as this being that was astronomically powerful at one point in time. So much so that he led a war against the cosmic entities, and that seemingly it took the power of the living tribunal to defeat this guy. Now, he ends up meeting his end in the Storm comic, but then he's resurrected by Mistress Death, or at least brought into her army in what she was waging against the universe, or even the multiverse, as a war among all the cosmic entities. That whole thing came out of the death of her brother Oblivion. And because no one had avenged her brother, that Death was taking it upon herself to seek vengeance on her own. But that's what Eternity's referencing here, right? Without Shango, there was no one to protect his realm, and all the other beings who were there were destroyed. But that's why you also have Null, the symbiote god, and Hadad himself, who says, death to the universe, death to Eternity, death to Aurora Monroe, because they're going after her and everything she cares about. The next thing Eternity points to is the Storm Sanctuary, which was effectively Storm's base of operations. And he says, your government barged into your home in your absence. They took the life of your friend, yet you chose to remain a god who would not raise these corrupt institutions to cinders. Now again, this has led to a lot of discourse online about whether or not it's actually referring to Armor and the death of Armor. But something to keep in mind, guys, is that in Storm issue number 10, the FBI ended up making their move against Storm. Now, this was a plot thread that started in Storm issue number 8, and it focused on a guy named Agent Fabi. That kind of came out of everything going on with Charles Xavier. For those of you guys who may recall, after the fall of Krakoa, Xavier was arrested. And then there was a story called X-Man manhunt, where basically Xavier was freed, more or less, by the X-Men, Storm ended up playing a role in the sense that she provided some measure of safe passage throughout it all, but the FBI had been trying to track down Xavier at the time, and that led them across Storm's path. Again, this was kind of a minor plot thread that likely would have been explored, but I don't know that it would have had any major significance. The long and short of it was that coming out of everything involving the FBI, they seemingly had a vendetta against Storm, so much so that by the time he got to Storm issue number 10, the FBI had killed 2 people. The first one was Manifold, and the second was Maggot. But that's why the context here is important, because once Eternity says your government barged into your home in your absence and then took the life of your friend, yet you chose to remain a god who would not raise these corrupt institutions to cinders, Eternity follows up and he says, your mercy has only emboldened them to attempt their wickedness a second time. So that's seemingly why they're here at the Storm Sanctuary, a second bite at the apple. And that's their confrontation with Armor. So given the context and what's happened over the course of the Storm comic, it doesn't look like Armor gets killed here. This is not really a reference to Armor dying. It's a reference to the FBI having previously killed allies of Storm and now attempting to essentially kill a second one, which goes into a statement made by Galacta when she says, the Storm Sanctuary was built on American soil. You brought that soil with you when you relocated the compound to the French Republic. In terms that you would better understand, the Storm Sanctuary is an enclave. It is perfectly within our jurisdiction as the FBI of the United States of America to bash your face in. Now, 2 things to know here. Number 1, the Storm Sanctuary was moved to Biarritz, France because of a conflict that had happened there, and Storm basically uses the sanctuary where the residents of Biarritz can reside until their town is repaired. We'll talk about that bit of a conflict here in a second. But the second thing, as far as Galacta goes, this was an unresolved plot element. We knew the FBI had Galacta, that was revealed in the Storm comic. We never found out how they got their hands on her. And in fact, we don't really even know if this is the Galacta that was originally introduced in Marvel Comics, or if this is quote unquote the main Marvel Universe version of Galacta or just some other version. It's not an overly significant plot point. It likely would have been explored further over the course of the comic, but such as it is, that never comes to fruition. But continuing on, right, Eternity tells Storm, your mercy made you sink low into forbidden dark magic and guilt-driven hypocrisy to bring your friend Maggot back to life after the FBI had killed him. Your friend in whom I imprisoned Egan. Your friend whose life force has intertwined with the spirit demon. Your friend whose life will be cut short if any being attempts to free the demon. The recoil from your misguided resurrection spell now ends innocent lives across your planet. It is only a matter of time before the Scarlet Witch discovers what you've done and comes for your head. Now, this is also an important plot device. Egan was a demon that was introduced in the Storm comic. The idea behind it was that Egan had destroyed any number of Sorcerer Supremes over the years. There came a point when Storm was basically dying and had gone to visit Jericho Drum, Dr. Voodoo. And in that conversation, Jericho Drum basically conjured up Egan and then brokered a deal between the two that Egan would basically cure Storm of any and all ailments that she has, basically making her the healthiest person in the universe. But there was a price to be paid. Storm would not be allowed to use her powers for 7 days. The result was that Storm did use her powers, and that was when Egan made his move and chose to attack. That whole conflict coincided with Storm visiting Dr. Doom as the Sorcerer Supreme within Latveria, and so in that conflict, Storm quote unquote died. And when that happened, Eternity had resurrected her and then turned her into his herald. So that's how Storm ends up being imbued with the powers of Eternity. And so following that, Egan's defeated, and then his entire life force is condensed down to a little ball and then fed to Maggot. But when Eternity's talking about the recoil from your misguided resurrection spell, this is actually tying in things that we had seen over the course of the Storm comic, but didn't have an explanation for. This poor bastard who's sitting on the toilet and his head exploded, this was just an event that happened, and we never got an explanation. My theory at the time was that it was Null the symbiote god returning or manifesting in some capacity because we got a black goo, right? Which is very reminiscent of the all black, right? Symbiote matter, essentially, which we know that Null originally created. We also got the death of an individual in the Storm Sanctuary, but while it was largely assumed that they were killed by some anti-mutant individual or some mutant who had gone crazy or whatever the case happened to be, because within the Sanctuary you had mutants and humans who were, as always, fighting against one another. What we're getting here is the fact that it kind of ties into the idea that magic has a price, that you can't just use magic to resurrect somebody from the dead with no consequence whatsoever. And so what Storm ended up doing was quite literally sacrificing the lives of other people in order to resurrect Maggot. But here's the kicker behind all of this. Storm didn't know that she was doing that. She didn't know that's what was happening. A lot of this seemed to tie into the fact that while Storm has historically had the ability to use magic and would occasionally use it within Marvel Comics, her chief power is the ability to manipulate weather, as most of you guys know. But what the story was experimenting with was the fact that Storm was delving more into her magical side than she used to, largely because of the fact that she is descended directly from Agamotto himself, right? One of the most powerful magical beings in existence. But she was essentially dabbling in forces that she didn't fully understand. And so in saving the life of Maggot, she was unwittingly sacrificing other people. And in fact, she'll address that here in a second. But Eternity continues on in the sense that after he said, "It is only a matter of time before the Scarlet Witch discovers what you've done and comes for your head," he says, "but not before Egan's war generals invade your planet, with the eventual goal of finding your friend, murdering him once again, and freeing their master from his brutalized corpse." And so Eternity says, "You love so deeply, but that has only made you draw so much hatred to yourself. But what are the sentiments and conspiracies of lesser beings to one who has been chosen by Eternity? You have done it your way, and your way did not work. My sister Death will end us all while you struggle with these measly distractions. As much as you would rather die than admit it, you need me." And that statement feeds into the greater narrative as a whole, because what's been happening over the course of the Storm comic, all these plot threads, right? There's a whole plot thread with the FBI coming after Storm. There is the plot thread with Akujin, which we'll talk about here in a second. Storm locking away storm gods, everything that was going on with Hadad, waging a war against pretty much all the gods that existed out there, going so far as to destroy the Council of Godheads, right? So Zeus and Vishnu and any number of guys who are out there, that once again, Mistress Death going on a rampage due to the death of Oblivion would in turn start resurrecting all these beings across the cosmos and even across the multiverse and going to war against the entirety of the multiverse. Because again, one of the things that we talked about in a previous video and something that Marvel's never really answered, but seemingly this story would have given us an answer to, is that while you do have different versions of Mistress Death across the multiverse, are they all just facsimiles of one version of Mistress Death? Which is to say, if you guys remember the story Thanos Imperative, right, where you had the Cancerverse, which was a universe where no one could die because Mistress Death in that reality was literally killed, that universe was brought to an end when Thanos brought Mistress Death from the main Marvel universe to the Cancerverse, so reintroducing death to that reality. But you basically had two versions of Mistress Death running around. And so it seemed to point to the idea that there were multiple versions of Mistress Death, but all of whom were just part of a singular Mistress Death out there in the multiverse. Again, it doesn't fully get explored, but the fact is that Mistress Death would have united all these beings who had died across the multiverse, every version of every superhero, and that war would be fought in an attempt to save all of existence, the multiverse itself. And so that's what Eternity's talking about here, because he tells her, "Merge with me once more and let us put an end to all these threats together in one fell swoop. All your troubles will fade away in but a moment if you merge." Because that's true. Given the power of Eternity and what he's capable of, pretty much every threat, except for the threat of Mistress Death, would come to an end in the blink of an eye, right? They would end so fast that that would be the only main plot going forward. And that seemed to be the idea of what it is that Miriwa was going for here. But the response of Storm is she says, "My people died because I used dark magic to bring Japheth back," right? She didn't know that. And she says, "When I was but a child, when I had just been blessed with my mutant gifts, my village suffered from a drought. With my gifts, I conjured so much rain that mudfishes skipped across farms, but I would later discover I did not conjure rain in the true sense. Rather, I had stolen the precipitation that would have fallen elsewhere. Several other villages suffered worse droughts because of me. That's true. That's actually an accurate statement. It has long since been a part of Storm's mythology, and it's something that nobody ever really talks about. Storm doesn't create weather. Storm borrows the things necessary to create weather in that localized space. It gets pulled from somewhere else. Now, it's a part of her character that you never really see, because for the most part, this is one of a very few times where there have been meaningful consequences for her doing something like that. But at the time that this was done in X-Men Volume 1, back in issue number 78, it was designed to illustrate why it is that Storm doesn't just cure all the problems in the world as far as drought and any environmental issues, because something has to be pulled from something else. So she can't save the world all at one time. And so that's why she says, every day I wonder how many lives were lost in those settlements, and every day my heart breaks for them. In the use of my mystical gifts, I have committed the same crime, but I am a child no longer. Why do I commit the same errors? And the response of eternity is, you did not know. We are responsible for so much. We should also not carry the weight of actions we did not know the consequences of, which is a true statement, right? As people, we have a tendency to kind of beat ourselves over the head because a thing happened, even though we never could have reasonably seen that was going to happen. Sure, you go flying into an intersection in the middle of rush hour traffic, you should know you're going to get into a car crash. But if you give $5 to a homeless guy and that homeless guy is attacked by another homeless guy and killed for that $5, there's no way you could have known that was going to happen. So you can't punish yourself for that action. But Storm's response to this is a kind of proverb, right? A child stumbles and falls, and the child looks forward. But when an adult falls, the adult looks back. And so Storm just says, I am far from perfect. I have made mistakes, many mistakes. However, while you are presenting this scenario to me saying that my actions had unintended consequences and I am at fault for those consequences, I would look at it from the other side. If I did not confine Shango to a pocket dimension as I did, he would have fallen in the battle against Hadad, just like every other god in his realm. So I did not doom a people, I saved a life. But at what cost? Because Shango within this pocket dimension just kind of says, I can no longer feel the warmth of my people. What have you done, Earther? There is merit to the argument in saying it is better to die alongside your people than to live without them, especially if you're a god that loves his people, that cares about his people. And that's why Shango says, this punishment is far too great for my sin, Aurora. My people are my soul. It's like Black Panther, right? Black Panther would let the world burn before he let anything happen to Wakanda. He would destroy the rest of the world. He would fire off whatever weapons he needs to wipe out all life on Earth, save Wakanda if it meant protecting his people. But at the same time, he would happily lay his life on the line for his people, or die alongside them in battle. That's what it means to be a god king or a god. So it's actually really interesting to see the parallels between these two characters. But Storm says, the last time we were merged as Eternal Storm, you killed Hadad, Eternity, against my wishes. And that's why the two of them separated, because Storm, as most of you guys know, is avidly against taking a life, if at all possible. And Eternity acknowledges that. He says, I made you break your vow regarding taking a life. Hadad was defeated and helpless. An honorable warrior would not have done what I made us do. For my betrayal, I apologize. And it actually catches Storm off guard, because Eternity, being such an astronomically powerful cosmic entity, is number one, very proud, and number two, righteous in his beliefs. It's almost impossible to convince someone who is a believer that they could possibly be wrong. They will double down, they'll hunker down, they will convince themselves of whatever they need to convince themselves of that they were right. They will reject any and all possibility to being wrong. Eternity is just like that. But to see Eternity come along and humble himself is actually pretty incredible. And so Storm just says, the Orishas are a mighty pantheon. They would not have known defeat if Hadad were not among the army of the dead. You made us kill him. Now his wraith spearheads death's fight to end us all. And so that's her statement in saying, I am not the one that led to the death of all these gods. It was you. Right? If you had not killed Hadad, I would have locked him away in a pocket dimension and he would not have been a threat to anybody. But now he's leading the armies of Mistress Death. What's also really interesting here is we switch over to a moment where Hadad is going to war against Apocalypse alongside the Donny Cates version of Galactus from the Donny Cates run on Thor. Because lest we forget, Arakko is still a place. And for those of you guys who don't know what we're talking about, Arakko is basically the new name for Mars. And the idea behind it was that Arakko was originally populated by this long lost group of mutants from another dimension. When they ended up crossing from that dimension over into the main Marvel universe, they settled on Arakko. And they were some of the most powerful mutants that we had ever seen, right? That was all during the Krakoa era in the X-Men. Now, there ended up coming an event called Avengers vs. X-Men vs. Eternals, where Uranos, the grandfather of Thanos, had actually been sent to Arakko and wiped out like 98% of the population within a 50-mile radius. But because the population was so dense, it basically led to the wiping out of 98% of Arakko's entire population. But Arakko is still occupied. There are mutants that still live there. And the idea is that Apocalypse is in charge of this place. This is seemingly a plot thread that would have been explored, as well as an explanation of how it is that Galactus is here. Because for those of you guys who don't recall, during the events of Donny Cates' run on Thor, we were introduced to the Black Winter, which actually made a return during the Storm run, and we ended up learning there were a lot of Black Winters. But in the same way that Galactus travels the universe and consumes worlds to sustain himself, and then has his heralds that seek out worlds for him, that the Black Winter traveled the multiverse and consumed entire realities. It was a huge retcon of the origin of Galactus because the idea was that Galactus was created as a herald for the Black Winter and would basically travel the multiverse and bring the Black Winter to different universes so the Black Winter could consume it. It was a retcon that didn't last very long. Marvel undid it pretty quickly. That during that Donny Cates run on Thor, Thor killed Galactus and then ultimately ended up using Galactus's body as a bomb to destroy the Black Winter. And quite literally, Thor had Galactus's helmet in his throne room. He kept it as a trophy, essentially. But that ended up going into the Reckoning War with Fantastic Four issues 40 and 41 from Dan Slott, where Galactus was needed. And so Silver Surfer, along with every other herald of Galactus, had gone to resurrect Galactus, which is how he returns within Marvel Comics. And so what it looks like here is that because we're seeing this version of Galactus, the one that died, what we're probably talking about is a time-displaced Galactus. We're talking about Galactus that was taken by Mistress Death, and while he was eventually brought back, a version of him was kept by Mistress Death, or at the very least, she reached back in time and then grabbed him the moment he died, and then sent him out there as one of her soldiers. I mean, Mistress Death being as powerful as she is, the ability to manipulate time, for the most part, isn't really that difficult. But again, we don't definitively get an answer here because Marvel forced Mariwa to rush the story. And so at that point, Storm continues on. She says, the Federal Bureau would not have fostered their deadly interest in me or my friends if you had not hidden your son Abraxas in my sanctuary. The resurrection of my friend Maggot would not have murdered all those innocents if you had not merged his soul with the demon Egan. Akujin would not be so determined to invade Earth if you did not imprison her master in my friend's body. Because that was another plot thread that was going on, right? That Akujin was leading an entire army to Earth to basically destroy Storm and to free her master's soul. It was kind of an undercurrent story in the sense that it likely would have come to fruition at a future point, but it was happening in the background. And she says, the Scarlet Witch's faith and trust in me would be unwavering and unbroken if not for the blood of the guiltless that you have stained my hands with. Like every manipulative abuser, you chose me to be your host because of my proclivity for self-sacrifice. Everything you have done has been strategically designed to complicate my life, to surround me with hate, and put the people I love and swore to protect under a constant barrage of threats, so that when I am finally overwhelmed by a mountain of worry, to dig myself out of the trench of despair that you have put me in, I would have no other choice than to relinquish my body to you, to sacrifice my will and autonomy so my loved ones can be safe once more, i.e., You tried to back me into a corner, believing that I would have no choice but to turn to you. But her response is, never again. I will never merge with you. I don't care how bad things get. So it's basically Storm telling Eternity, we'll never be a couple again. We won't even be friends, right? That's never going to happen. And so at that point, we get a bit of a flashback. And it's actually a moment when Storm is talking to her mother. And these were the small bits of character development that we got over the course of the run that really made it as fantastic as it was. That Storm asks her mother, she says, if it was a gift, mother, why are you taking it from me? Now, we don't know exactly what Storm's talking about, but we do get an explanation. Her mother says it was not a gift, Aurora. Braiding your hair, cooking for you, those are gifts of service. The comic books that you've littered your room with, the toys in your closet, those are material gifts. But no, our family heirloom was not a gift. It was an honor I bestowed upon you as my daughter and princess. An honor, my daughter, can be bestowed and it can be taken away as well. And so Storm asks, what will happen to the ruby? Will you bestow it upon someone else? And her mother says, that is the thing with honor. It can be lost, but it can also be earned. The ruby is not forever beyond your reach. So clearly it was taken away as a form of punishment. And so Storm asks, how can I earn my honor back if the other children continue to make fun of me in school? And she says, they make jest of my hair and eyes. They mock the way I speak the language. How can I earn my honor back if the other children continue to act without honor? And that's where her mother gives her one of the most important lessons of all. She says, as you grow older, you will realize that change is hard, slow, and painful for most people. Some are even hopelessly incapable of change. But the good news is your honor is not dependent on theirs. Your good deeds do not require their validation to shine brightly. And so Storm asks, but why must I retain my honor if most people are without it? And her mother tells her, you're asking the wrong question. The real question is, why not retain your honor if most people are without it? It's the thing that makes you better than them. And so in that moment, we switch to Earth 61391. Now, this is where the last comic ended. It's basically the realm of the one above all, but not in the traditional sense, right? They're not fighting in the House of Ideas. That what Muriwa seemed to be putting forward is that the House of Ideas is just part of a larger multiverse. At least that seemed to be the case. He was creating what were called multiversal clusters. So basically it was the Omniverse, right? And we had a whole video discussing the nature of the Omniverse, that historically speaking in Marvel, people have made reference to the Omniverse, but given the context of the story, they were actually talking about the multiverse. They were not talking about multiple multiverses. But in this particular instance, and the conflict that's going on here, it's really just kind of Storm being stuck here within this reality. This is actually a reality that took place in an Iron Man story in an alternate universe. It was called I Am Iron Man, and it was a phenomenal story. But within this reality, Storm's daughter exists because one of the things that Storm had been historically struggling with in a number of stories outside of the Storm run that were written by Muriwa was the fact that she seemingly couldn't have kids. And so when Eternity approached her for the very first time before the Storm comic picks up, that he showed her a glimpse of her future and showed her that she would at one point have a daughter, because Storm was losing hope, right? Knowing that she couldn't have a daughter, her big crisis was, why protect the world if she cannot pass on anything in the world, right? She's saving lives and can't produce life of her own. I don't know if I agree with that. I don't think a person is less than if they cannot have kids. But the point is, Storm saw herself that way. And so when she ended up in this reality, she realized her daughter is here, or at least the daughter that she may have at one point, which really kind of filled her with hope. But again, because the story's rushed, this conflict comes to an end in the blink of an eye. And so all that's left is that Storm, alongside the allies of this universe, are trying to figure out what to do next. And Storm ends up taking the ruby from her daughter, which is actually given to her by her daughter, who explains that in the future that she comes from, Storm is dead. That Storm died when her daughter was about 6 years old, that there are no Omega level mutants in that future. Again, we don't know why. We don't know what transpired in that future that wiped out the most powerful mutants in existence, including Storm. We simply just know they're not there. But because it is a mother and a daughter reuniting, the ruby is given, and that is Storm's passage. That's what brings her back to the main Marvel universe. And so what this does is it picks up with the mother of Storm from an alternate reality. She was the one that was facing off against Storm and sending her through all these multiverse clusters. Is how Storm ended up passing through the Jujutsu Kaisen universe and all that kind of stuff. And we just kind of get this monologue, right? Many stories are told with their endings kept a mystery. Their secrets are held close to the chest. And so in this moment, Storm's mother is in the realm of Mistress Death, and given how astronomically powerful she is, seemingly she has the ability to defeat Mistress Death. But then you go to the royal palace of Olympus, and it says, I will spare you the attempt at trickery, though you welcome it. Because the reality is this focuses on the moment when Akujin's forces had invaded Olympus with the intention of destroying the Olympian gods, and then using the dimension of Olympus to send their army directly to Earth. Because one of the things that we talked about is that while the forces of Akujin have been traveling basically different dimensions, trying to sneak into Earth, there are precious few dimensions that have direct access to Earth. Olympus, as most of you guys know, the home of Zeus and Hera and Hercules and all those, is one of them. And they were trying to use it, but ultimately they're destroyed by the forces of Olympus. And then we go to Tartarus, right? The realm of the underworld. And we're told the ending of this story is no enigma. You already know how this story ends. Despite the great number of threats that surround Storm and drown our very universe, Storm wins. And Storm literally chases Galacta out of her home. And that's where the comic ends. That's where the comic ends. This is what happens when Marvel dicks around and forces a writer to end a comic book early, despite all the plot threads. This could have been one of the greatest Storm runs of all time. I'm gonna make a commentary video talking about this and how badly Marvel is screwing up in the modern day. Because honestly, I'm about sick of this shit. I will catch you all later. Peace.